From the Infowars.com studios, it's The Real News with your host, David Knight.
Welcome on this Monday, August the 6th, 2018. I'm David Knight, your host of Real News. And at the top of Drudge Report, you will see that Facebook and Apple have removed pages of Infowars. They have also, Apple has purged every iTunes archive of podcasts. That's the archives of this broadcast, in case you don't catch it on radio and television. They have removed the podcasts from iTunes from everything except for this program, interestingly enough. We'll talk about that. But, of course, BuzzFeed and especially Sleeping Giants are pushing them very hard. Why haven't you taken that program down? Well, we'll see what happens with that. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the First Amendment. You know, as I said on Friday when I was guest hosting the Alex Jones show, what really scares me about the situation here is that this is not simply a move by the political elite, by the technological elite in Silicon Valley, who are hardcore left Democrats. It's not simply a move by those elitists to shut down the First Amendment. What concerns me is the grassroots acceptance by the vast majority of the Democrat Party that now despise free speech. And so we're going to take a look at the First Amendment today. We're going to take a look at what it really says. You know, only 40% of the people even know what's in it, according to a survey. That's also an article that's up on Drudge today. Only 40% of the people even know what's in the First Amendment. Do the people who can list some of these things even know what's in the First Amendment? You know, one of the 5 parts of the First Amendment that was mentioned was freedom of religion. Well, that's not in the First Amendment. Even the article doesn't know what's in the First Amendment. It is not freedom of religion. It doesn't mean that you can privately have some beliefs and you can do whatever you want to as long as you keep it inside your home, go inside of a closet to practice your religion. It is the free exercise of religion, the free exercise of religion. You're not going to gag me. You're not going to put me in a closet, whether I want to talk about politics or religion. I know you don't like to hear about politics and religion. That's what we talk about here all the time, which is why it is so controversial. Those are the things that get everybody upset. And that's why we need to have the attitude that we have now lost in the West thanks to political correctness. And this agenda that has been pushed by the Democrat Party, by the universities for so long, they have been so successful that people don't want to hear anything that gets them upset. If this is not the standard narrative, shut up. You're not going to talk about that. Shut up. That's hateful. I hate it when you say that, so that is hate speech. They simply hate your speech. They hate freedom of speech. Again, it was not Voltaire who said it, but it was a distillation of what he said. That I may despise what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Why? Because that's your right as well. Are we going to have a mob oppression of free speech? That apparently is going to be that way. Because your free speech is not dying simply because Twitter and Facebook and Google and Apple don't like it. Simply because these fangs, you know, that's what they call them in terms of stock market. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, those stocks that have inflated the stock market. And it may be the fangs that puncture it when that stuff comes down. But they have sunk their fangs into the First Amendment. And we have to ask ourselves, as we look at what is happening, are we going to have a First Amendment or are we going to have a double standard? We saw this very clearly with Candace Owen over the weekend. She was shut down by Twitter. Why? Because she repeated the racist, hateful, by their standards, tweets of Sarah Jeong, who was hired by the New York Times. She just changed what that Asian woman had said about white people. She changed it to put blacks in there and Jewish people in there. And that caused her to get a ban. And then when everybody started talking about the hypocrisy, they reversed that ban. But they were going to ban her for 12 hours for doing exactly the same thing that this other woman got hired by the New York Times for doing. Welcome. It's Censorship Monday, August the 6th, 2018. I'm David Knight, and we have the fangs are sticking their fangs into Infowars. That's Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. Of course, Amazon and Netflix haven't done anything to censor us yet because we're not involved with them as far as I know. If we were, they would be shutting us down, but it's also Facebook and it is Apple the social media companies, maybe we should call them the socialist media companies, because that seems to be where they hang out on the political spectrum. They don't like our free speech, and they're going to shut it down. And it's being pushed by the government. You have to understand that this is not simply their private prerogative. Yes, we know what their politics are. And as we're going to point out, we've had Daryl Issa say, if they're going to target for censorship conservative politicians, as we have seen them done, and if they're going to allow and promote other politicians, then maybe the Federal Election Commission should be taking a look at these people. I think, and I have said this before, and I know a lot of libertarians disagree with this, I think that these are public forums. Facebook, Twitter, Google is a search engine. They have become so pervasive. You know, in the UK, you had Kleenex and Hoover lost their copyrights because they had become so widely used. It was a generic term. If you talk about a vacuum cleaner, as a matter of fact, it even became a verb. They don't talk about vacuuming the floor. They say, well, we got to Hoover the floor. And in a similar fashion, Kleenex became so widely used, they said, well, you've lost your copyright on that. It has now entered the vernacular, and you can't copyright that. And I think that what we have seen with Twitter, Facebook, and Google is that they have lost their ability to censor people because they don't like what we have to say. How do we support the idea that a small baker or a small photographer cannot refuse to serve someone? We're going to force them to do that. And yet we can say that Facebook, Google, and Twitter can refuse to serve information to people when they have a monopoly. These small bakers and photographers were targeted for shutdown, targeted for persecution. But they don't have any monopoly on that. That doesn't mean that if they won't bake a cake for somebody because they have a Christian problem with that, because it violates their conscience, they can still go somewhere else and get a photographer or get a cake baked. But these groups have a de facto monopoly. And I think that ought to be investigated on that, but certainly on the Federal Election Commission. So we've had Facebook now completely remove pages of Infowars. We had Apple remove 5 of the 6 podcast programs that we have. Mine is the only one that is still there. They're still pushing them, so we'll see what happens with that. And Spotify, which last week had pulled several episodes of Alex Jones's podcast, saying they didn't like the content. It was hateful, they said. And again, as we have seen these vicious lies, I talked about how even Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone, who's usually a pretty good reporter, he did some really good reporting on the banks that were too big to jail and the connections of HSBC and so forth and money laundering. He's done some really good series, but he didn't do any investigation when he did a hit piece on us. Because what he did was, it was really kind of an echo chamber, if you will. It was kind of circular defamation. Yeah, he does a link to the New York Times, says, oh, look, these videos were removed because they had hateful content. The New York Times, of course, does a defamatory summary of what the video was about and says, well, YouTube did it. So Matt Taibbi, Rolling Stone, says, look, New York Times said this. New York Times says, YouTube said this. And then you got Forbes that comes in and says, the guy that they show in that picture, that after this kid is punching on him and hitting him and getting in his face and so forth, finally he shoves the kid goes to the ground and he's laying there whining. They said, that was Alex Jones that pushed him down there. I mean, that's absolutely amazing. Doesn't look anything like Alex Jones, but it is circular defamation. It is an echo chamber that they have here. So Spotify took down several episodes of Alex Jones last week, and now they have removed it in its entirety from it. So the censorship continues, and it escalates. 4 pages removed by Facebook from Infowars. As Mashable points out, the only one that is there is Real News with David Knight, the program you're listening to right now. As BuzzFeed was talking about it, as of Sunday evening, only one Infowars podcast, a daily news recap show. That's what this is, a daily news recap. This is commentary, folks. By the way, BuzzFeed, it's commentary. Do you say that about any other radio show? Do you say that about Rush or Savage or Hannity, that it's a news recap show? I talk about the issues of the day, yes. We talk about the news, yes. I'm not just recapping it and reading the headlines. I'm giving you analysis. And I'm talking about what people like BuzzFeed and Rolling Stone and New York Times are doing to slant the news. That's what I'm talking about here. It's not a recap. It's an analysis. Anyway, this daily news recap show called Real News with David Knight remains on the platform. It's not immediately clear why this show is unaffected. Yeah, that's right. Pull him down. See, this is the dangerous thing, is that we have now the press acting as cheerleaders for censorship. Apple declined to comment on the status of Real News with David Knight, so they'll continue to push on it, and so will Sleeping Giants. The people who were the activists who organized boycotts against Breitbart, against Laura Ingraham, and so forth. The guy who, interestingly enough, it was about 2 weeks ago that the guy that was running this, an ad agency guy, wanted to remain anonymous, and he would do interviews as long as the press would keep him anonymous, and said, yeah, okay. So he's out there targeting people as an ad executive. A lot of the accounts that he was running with the organization that he worked for. And then they came back and said, well, we didn't have those accounts, or I wasn't working for them at the time I organized the boycotts of, it was BMW, Adobe, Xfinity, so forth. Says, I wasn't working with Goodby, Silverstein, and Partners. Those clients were not there at that time. But he didn't say where he was working at the time, because he organized a lot of boycotts of a lot of different media organizations. And now he has isolated and targeted Infowars, and so has left-stream media. So as we look at this, and we look at this double standard, as I was talking about on Friday, to me, the thing that stands out about this reporter who was hired by the New York Times, Sarah Zhang, young Asian woman, she hates white people, especially people like me, just because of who I am and because of what I believe. She hates me because I'm white. She hates me because I'm male. She hates me because I'm old. She hates me because I'm conservative or libertarian. And so this is identity hatred. You want to call it identity politics? Yes, it is the identity politics of the left. We now have Kamala Harris coming out and saying, you're not allowed to use the term identity politics. Why? Because it exposes what they are. As soon as we understand what they are, they assume a new name, a new alias, right? They called themselves liberals. Why? Because they wanted to take over from the people who really believed in liberty. A lot of libertarians will say, don't call me a libertarian. I don't want to be associated with the Libertarian Party or whatever. Call me a classical liberal. Because in the 1700s, the 1800s, people who believed in individual liberty and in economic liberty were called liberals. And so the socialist authoritarians stole that label because it was a good label. So they stole it. And then when people found out they were liberals, they started calling themselves, well, we'll call ourselves progressives. We'll go by that name now. And now they're just owning the socialist label. But they're saying, oh, that's not communist. Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is. But they continually change the labels. They will put labels upon you, try to stick those labels on you. But they always seize the high ground rhetorically by the labels that they use. So when you out them as playing identity politics, oh, you can't use that word anymore. Pretty soon now, that is going to be a banned word. So you use the word identity politics, which, by the way, is what they're doing. And when Kamala Harris talks about that, she labels it. She goes down every single group. Oh, all these groups, they're all with us. And we're going to stand for all those groups. But everybody else, don't you use that term identity politics, because that defines what the Democrats are. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Well, I tell you what, it's just amazing to see the press embracing censorship. You know, it's not just Infowars. You've now got the New York Times silent about Julian Assange, even as their lawyer is saying, if they arrest Julian Assange, that puts us in legal jeopardy if we do any real reporting. Oh, but that's okay, because they're not going to do any real reporting. They're going to shut down Infowars. Anybody that dissents against the official story or exposes the truth or puts out documents. We're a long way, folks, from the Washington Post that was lionized in the movie by Spielberg. The Washington Post and New York Times had never published the Pentagon Papers today. They would be telling you the government lies, and they would be hiding that information. And they don't have any intention of ever doing anything like that in the future. Because if they did, they would be listening to their lawyer. But they won't even report what their lawyer says. It's other people who are reporting what the New York Times lawyer says. New York Times won't report that. Instead, they hire this hateful little 3-year-old who goes out there and spreads virulent racism, says it's a joke. I saw a tweet from Ed Snowden. I was totally disappointed in Ed Snowden. He said, well, okay, look, all you people who look at all this stuff in her satire. No, we're looking at the double standard, Ed Snowden. And freedom of the press is something that is very important. It's important that she can say that, and that's fine. You know, if the New York Times wants to own that kind of racism and hatred, we understand that that's where they're coming from. And now they've made it very clear that that's what that institution represents. But there's no interest in taking down the New York Times or censoring what they have to do. And yet we got CNET out here. 7 questions that Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg needs to answer about Infowars. This is written by somebody called Owen Shroyer. I don't know who this guy is, but Ian, I've got one question for you. Why don't you go to work for Pravda or Izvestia? You know, Pravda was supposed to mean truth in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, doesn't exist anymore, but it was supposed to mean truth. And Izvestia was news. And the saying that the Russian people had was that there is no truth in Pravda, there's no news in Izvestia. They were not fooled by that. Do you think you can fool the people if the information isn't true? Why do you think that Infowars is still there? It's because when we question a narrative like we just saw with the silly narrative, the multiple choice, actually it wasn't multiple choice, they give you one choice and you have to believe that. And then the next day they tell you something completely different happened in Las Vegas and you're obliged to now bow down, kowtow to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and say, yes, okay, now that is true. It's exactly the opposite of what you told us yesterday, but that's true. Oh, now you got a third version. Oh, now you got a fourth version. Okay, that's fine. We'll go with that. No questioning of the government official story. Don't ever question it. Don't ever question what happened at 9/11. Don't ever question the fact that we had steel skyscrapers. As President Trump said at the time, the strongest that he's ever seen. He said they bombed the foundation back in the early 90s. It didn't do anything to that building. He goes, that building's got steel on the outside. It's one of the strongest buildings I've ever seen. And yet, in just a couple of hours, it collapsed into its footprint. And we only had 2 buildings out of 3 that collapsed that were even hit by a plane. The third building wasn't even hit by a plane. And you got the BBC reporting that it's already fallen down when it's over the shoulder. And you got recordings of the guy who owns it saying, pull it, which is what they say when it's a demolition. We're not allowed to ask any questions about that. I don't know what happened 9/11, but I know that what the government is telling us didn't happen there. You're not allowed to ask any questions about the Zapruder film. Shut up. You're not allowed to talk about that. We've already come up with an official story, so just shut up about it. No matter how ridiculous the government story, you just shut up and believe it. Well, that's the way the Soviet Union operated. That's the way China operates today. So Owen Shroyer at CNET, why don't you go to China? Because they're still hiring people like you. They would love to have a journalist like you. Love to have a journalist like you. Don't question the official story of the government. Just slander the people that the government doesn't like because they tell the truth. Because we show that they don't have, the emperor doesn't have any clothes, that their pants are on fire. So Owen Shroyer and CNET, go work. You're working for the wrong people. CNET, go work for China. A good example of this is the double standard that happened over the weekend with Candace Owens, saying the same thing that the new New York Times editor Sarah Zhang did, when she was saying white people are fit only to live underground like groveling goblins. That's one of the few things that she put out there that I can repeat on the radio. So Candace Owens said, okay, well, let's do the same thing, except I will take all of her hateful, racist tweets that she put out. Oh, it's just a joke, says Ed Snowden. And he says, she's done some good work on some technology issues. Well, I don't really care. I mean, if she's hateful and racist, we're not going to allow that. If you accuse somebody of doing the same type of stuff that she did, they are purged. Roseanne was purged. Infowars is being purged now, just on accusations of that. But these people can Sarah Zhang, she can do that repeatedly, and it's okay. You can make jokes about raping babies. It's okay. It's okay. We've had all the stars who are in Guardians of the Pedophile. Even Kurt Russell has come out and says, hey, Let's chill on all this political correctness. Well, you didn't say anything when they did it to Roseanne, did you, Kurt? Or Chris Pratt? Or the rest of the people? I expected better from Kurt. I expected better from Chris Pratt. I didn't expect the Hollywood leftists to understand the double standard, but I did expect better from them. Quite frankly, I don't think anybody ought to be pulled out for what they say. I mean, I think that people ought to look very carefully at James Gunn because there's other issues involved. It's not just his tweets. It is also the videos that were shared with him by a known child pornographer, guy that was convicted for that, and his response about how pleased, if I can just put it that way. He was a little bit more explicit about how pleased he was with those pedophile videos that he received. I think there's something going on with James Gunn that is beyond a joke. Sarah Jeong may have just been making sarcastic jokes repeatedly over and over and over again, but she doesn't get the treatment that Roseanne Barr gets. And we're held to a different standard than the New York Times. People who have actively lied on behalf of the government in order to push war, they still have their platform, don't they? And it tells you something about why they want to get rid of us. And so what Candace Owens did, she just changed those joke tweets, just took out the word white and put black and Jewish in there. And I'm not even going to repeat what she had to say because it was disgusting when it was said by Sarah Jeong. But as we look at this, the Washington Examiner is pointing out that in spite of all of the identity politics and the racism of the left, Black, Asian, and Hispanic support may be enough to help Trump win re-election. And this is a survey that was done by Zogby. It does pretty accurate polls, one of the few polling organizations that really is accurate. The interesting thing about this is that the majorities of Hispanic, Asian, and African-American voters disapproved of President Trump. But they found enough of them there that see that the Democrats have to have 100% participation in identity politics in order to win. If you crack that, if you don't get 99% of the black vote, if you only get 90% of the black vote, you don't win the election. That's how marginalized the Democrat Party is. And the most interesting thing about that is that only 25% of African Americans said the economy would do better, but 45% said that they would do better. Isn't that interesting? Because they're hearing the media. That's the cognitive dissonance between the reality that they're experiencing and the message they're hearing from the fake news media like CNN. Welcome back. I'm David Knight. As we were going to break, I pointed out the difference in a Zogby poll as they were looking at minority groups, Hispanics, African Americans, Asians. They were saying, who are you going to vote for? Well, the majority of them didn't like Trump, but enough of them did that it could get him elected, because that made the difference in the last election, quite frankly. They didn't have unanimous support of the black community, and that did end the Democrat Party. But the most interesting thing about the poll was that even though 25% of the people said that of the African-American people polled, 25% said, no, the economy is not going to do good in the next 4 years. But 46% of them said, I will do well. And see, what that represents is the cognitive dissonance of your own personal experiences versus what you're being fed by CNN and the mainstream media. That's why they want to get rid of Infowars. That's why they want to control the narrative, as they did the entire time I was growing up. And just like the people in Russia, I was not fooled, and I'm sure many of you were not fooled either, by the nightly news that we had from ABC, CBS, NBC. They were the only three sources, and they added a government news source, NPR, of course, totally objective, right? The CIA was exposed, Operation Mockingbird. They even had a title for it, where they would go out and get the executives of ABC, CBS, and NBC, as well as New York Times and Washington Post, to push their narrative. They would always report the same things from the same angles, the same stories. Now, many of the American people went for it, but many of us did not. Many of us realized that we were being trolled, just like the people in Russia did. And that's why they have to try to shut down and silence this. As I've said before, the left, as you look at them, whether it is the riots that we had in Portland this last weekend or wherever they go, they just want to shut down other people speaking. And it doesn't matter whether it is the thugs on the street with Antifa, with their clubs and their Molotov cocktails, or whether it is the thugs at the top of Silicon Valley with their algorithms. All they want to do is to shut down what you have to say. We saw it at the protest that we went to of the abortion clinic here. We had signs that stop black genocide. And this is the first time they weren't calling themselves Antifa at the time. But it was the same people, and we had found pictures of them where they were marching with hammers and sickles and so forth. Oh, yeah, they're socialists, whatever you want to call them. They're anti-fascist. They're anti-First Amendment, anti-FA, because they showed up with simply black cardboard signs that said nothing. And as my wife would stand there with a sign, they would put their black sign in front of her sign. She would go high, they would go high. She would go low, they would go low. How's that, Michelle Obama? Yeah, that's what they do. They just want to cover up what you have to say. They don't have an argument to make. They'll hurl some epithets at you. You're racist, you're sexist, you're homophobe, you're xenophobe, whatever. They just don't want you to speak. It isn't hate speech. They hate speech. They hate free speech. And now we got Kamala Harris saying you can't use the term identity politics. Why? Because it exposes their tactics, folks. This is an article from Breitbart as she's talking about the fact that Doug Jones won his Senate race in Alabama because black women voted for him. Then she goes on to say, but don't talk about identity politics. She said, instead of thinking women of color, we should be electing them. And she said, now, I'm aware that some people would say that what I just said is plain identity politics. Yes, it is, Kamala. You're so perceptive. But I have a problem, guys, with that phrase, identity politics. When people say it, it's a pejorative. Yes, it is. We're sick and tired of you pitting one group against another. Divide and conquer. And, of course, nothing gets them more angry with their identity politics than when you have a black conservative woman like Candace Owens or a black conservative man like Clarence Thomas, right? Or Thomas Sowell, or many others. You do that, you get off the plantation. Well, they're going to come after you hard. She says, when people say that, when they say identity politics, it's a pejorative. That phrase is used to divide. No, identity politics is used to divide, not the phrase. It is an identification of what you are using, Kamala Harris, to divide the public. It is used to divide and to distract. Its purpose is to minimize and marginalize issues that impact all of us. See, this is why they continue this Black Lives Matter approach, the NFL protest. First of all, it is a kick the cat protest. You got a problem with the police? Take it up with the police. You feel like you're being attacked as a minority? Take it to the group and say, hey, they're coming after us. They're going to be coming after you soon. And quite frankly, they are. You could make the case more white people are being killed by the police. I understand it's a higher percentage of black people, but it is more white people. So use that. Get the larger group on your side and stop the problem. Instead, what they use is identity politics. They divide people. They say, you stay away. This is a black issue. This is black versus blue, and black versus white, and black versus the military. And so they kick the cat. When they've got a problem with the police tactics, instead of trying to reform it, instead of trying to create a large consensus, they isolate themselves, or actually the political leaders like Kamala Harris isolate them. Colin Kaepernick, isolate them for their own benefit. The race pimps do that. So they don't actually solve the problem. They want this problem to continue. They don't want a resolution. They want a continuing irritation that they can use for their political gain. That's what identity politics is about. I think the whole thing with the NFL is a very, very clear example of that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment when we talk about the First Amendment here. But she said, think about when you've heard it raised. It's when you talk about race, we talk about gender, when we talk about sexual orientation. Yeah, because that's their identity politics. Appealing to voters based on who they are. Vote for me, Kamala Harris. Why? Because I'm a black woman. You should be voting for me because I'm a black woman. What has she done? Well, I don't know. What has Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez done? Nothing at all. But vote for her, because she used to be all about reducing taxes and helping entrepreneurs, and now she doesn't like that. Now she's a socialist. But now, most importantly, she has an identity that can get her elected. And so when we look at Twitter, As the New York Post is pointing out, records show that Twitter has sought to influence Congress on behalf of Democrat causes, and congressmen. They were caught shadow banning Republicans last month, and federal records reveal 80% of Twitter's corporate PAC contributions in 2018 election cycle so far have gone to Democrat candidates, none of whom are moderate. So in an interview on Fox News with Maria Bartiromo, Representative Darrell Issa said, if Twitter, Facebook are going to go political through algorithms, then maybe we should talk to the Federal Election Commission. He said in the case of Twitter and these others, to be honest, if they're going to go politic through algorithm, they could well come under the Federal Election Commission. They could be considered to, in fact, be making an in-kind donation. They could have to register what those dollars are. Think about this, folks. If they're going to promote certain groups and causes, politicians, and if they're going to censor and attack others, they have made a double contribution, haven't they? They have pushed back against one group and supported another. He says, for right now, what we want to do is we want to get them to admit the truth, which it doesn't seem logical that when they come up with a new algorithm, it only seems to affect Republican conservatives such as Jim Jordan and the like. And as they point out, a Gateway Pundit study in June of top conservative news outlets found that Facebook has eliminated 93% of traffic to top conservative websites. Well, they've done it 100% to Infowars. How about that? How about that? Why are they after us the most? Well, it's because we are the tip of the spear, folks. When we come back, we're going to talk about driving Miss Feinstein. You know, it's kind of interesting as we talk about fake news and how it needs to be vetted. It was Dianne Feinstein who said we need to have licenses for journalists to make sure we don't have fake news out there. This is a lady who for 20 years didn't know that her chauffeur was a Chinese spy. And she's going to tell you who you can listen to, who to believe. Okay, we'll be right back. Stay with us. I'm David Knight. Welcome back. Yeah, why don't you get out of our life and let us decide what is real and what isn't. But, of course, we're going to have the government decide that for us. We're going to have the people in Silicon Valley decide that for us. The people who are in the area there that Dianne Feinstein lives in. Right there in San Francisco. Drive-in Miss Feinstein. She's been driven for decades by a Chinese spy. And, of course, that all happened 5 years ago. We're going to talk about what is behind that. But I think it is especially ironic today that it would be, as we see the hammer being lowered on Infowars here, being purged off of Facebook, that we see that it was Dianne Feinstein that was 5 years ago saying, and this is a quote from her, some senators wanted to include reporters that had professional qualifications, you know, like the New York Times that just hired Sarah Jean, in spite of all of her racist jokes and tweets and so forth. But they would be real news. And, of course, Dianne Feinstein and Chuck Schumer and others on the left who are not winning the argument, they wanted to be able to vet who was real and who wasn't, to control that. They were going to have licensing of journalists. And now we have the journalists across the spectrum begging for conservative sites to be shut down. They're coming for us, but they're also coming for Sean Hannity and so forth. It's across the board. Their tactic is to target, to isolate, destroy, then move on to the next one. This is Bill Ayer's target, the way that they operate. Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. But they had the journalists, a group of news journalists who participated in a private forum online, 2007 to 2010. The forum was to enable news reporters to discuss news reporting and political issues in private with candor. But what it revealed was that they wanted to suppress negative views about candidate Barack Obama in 2008. For example, a 2008 debate in which Obama was questioned on his association with the controversial Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Oh, that's just a conspiracy theory, right? Oh, but let's not put that out there. They had The Nation's Richard Kim wrote that George Stephanopoulos, say it's going to go beyond conservatives. They said, The Nation says, well, because he questions Barack Obama's association with Jeremiah Wright, that George Stephanopoulos was, quote, a disgusting little rat snake. And then The Guardian, Michael Tomasky, chimed in and said, we all have to do what we can to kill ABC. and this idiocy. All these people who are out there leading the charge to take us down. You know, when you start the French Revolution, eventually it comes back around, and even Robespierre faces the guillotine, doesn't he? So it's going to come back to CNET. It's going to come back to BuzzFeed. It's going to come back to all these people. And this guy, Sleeping Giants, who's organizing boycotts of everybody, it's going to come back to his economic pocketbook as well. You just watch, see what happens. Spencer Ackerman, who was in with the Washington Independent, who's now with the Daily Beast, said, if the right forces us all to either defend Jeremiah Wright or tear him down, no matter what we choose, we lose the game they put upon us. Instead, let's take one of them down. Somebody like Fred Barnes or Karl Rove. Who cares? We will call them racists. Yes, that's the way the left operates. And that is exactly what is happening right now. And the person at the front of it all was Dianne Feinstein. Dianne Feinstein, who doesn't know a chauffeur and a gopher from a Chinese spy. Before I get into that, by the way, you know, this is a story that came out last week. After a week online, Zero Hedge reports NATO's latest counter-disinfo Facebook game is a complete flop. See, Facebook has to take us down because people can think for themselves. And the interesting thing about this is that they paid a lot of money to a group in Latvia to create a little game called News Hero. It was developed over a period of 4 months, and guess what? Your taxes paid for that because America pays for NATO. They had 8 people at the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Latvia. They created this game, and then they, after a week online, they had 3 shares and 123 likes. And so they kind of quietly skulked away with this thing. And what did it do? Well, it was going to be a weapon. This is what they said, a weapon in the disinformation battleground. It was going to counter the big, scary Russians and so forth. NBC reported it this way. They said researchers at the Defense Alliance have developed a Facebook game that they believe can help people to be more discerning when they are sharing news online because you're too stupid to be able to recognize it yourself. So they're going to help you with a little game called News Hero. The game has been taken down, but it put gamers in the position of being a news publisher in a professional newsroom, and they had to decide whether the headlines past their virtual desk were real or fake. The game's creators say they're seeking to educate the Western public on how to properly discern real news from fake news or worse. I think they know. I think the problem is that Americans already know how to do this. The Russians knew how to do this under the Soviet Union, and that's the problem. That's why you have to have the hammer of censorship. Dianne Feinstein doesn't know how to do it. Or if she does, maybe she was complicit in this. And again, this is a whistle that was blown on her last week. The San Francisco Chronicle put these details out. This is something that happened 5 years ago. They had some new details that came out. But for 20 years, this guy was operating right under her nose, as she was, for a great deal of that time, head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. This guy is even attending Chinese consulate functions on behalf of the senator. Absolutely amazing. And yet she wants to tell us what is real news and what's fake news. She doesn't even know what a fake driver is. And one individual who is retired FBI said, think about Dianne Feinstein, what she had access to. 1, she had access to the Chinese community here in San Francisco. Great amount of political influence. 2, correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, you are wrong. Dianne Feinstein still has very close ties to the intelligence community there in Washington, D.C. Yeah, you are wrong that it's only, correct me if I'm wrong. She's got a little bit of connection there. Yeah, she's got a lot of connection there. I tweeted about this, and I said, we see that this is happening, and we know in terms of the Chinese presidents, we had who on first, Xi's on second, and I don't know, that would be Dianne Feinstein, I don't know is stealing home. Or maybe they do know. Because if we go back, I said Clinton's transferred sensitive tech to China. Remember 20 years ago what was going on, 25 years ago, as he became the chauffeur for Dianne Feinstein? We had Hillary involved in all kinds of Chinese spying. The Clintons were, right? Back in 1996, Bill Clinton was running for re-election. That's when we had all these scandals. As Judicial Watch pointed out, Chinagate. Remember all these different names? John Wong, Charlie Tree. Oh, they were just barking up the Wong tree, right? No, actually, there was quite a bit of information there. That's what the Democrats don't want you to see. So you got John Wong. He was a close associate of James Riyadi, an Indonesian industrialist. John Wong had been appointed Deputy Secretary of Commerce in 1993. By 95, he moved to the DNC. That's where all the crooks go, right? He generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal contributions from foreign sources. Oh, what? Was this collusion with a foreign government like the Chinese communists? Yes, it was. He even pled guilty, and he got one felony count of campaign finance violation. But, Democrats, okay. Charlie Tree, like John Wong, he raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal contributions from foreign sources to the DNC. One of these was a Chinese arms dealer, made a $450,000 contribution to Clinton's legal defense fund. They had to return it after they discovered what it was really about, after other people discovered what it was about, quite frankly. And then there was, of course, one of his main sources of cash was a Chinese billionaire who had connections to the Chinese government. That billionaire was arrested in 2015. And then as one of the former UN General Assembly, President John Ash, of course, was also caught in that bribery case. The day before, he was supposed to testify about links between the Clintons and this Chinese billionaire. John Ash, if you remember back in 2015, was found dead that morning. At first, they reported it was a heart attack. Then they said, well, no, actually, his throat was crushed. Oh, he must have dropped a barbell on his throat. Yeah, I'm sure that's what happened. And then Johnny Chung gave $366,000 to the DNC prior to the 96 campaign. And on and on. All of this stuff is documented, folks. You want collusion? You want campaign violation? You want felonies? We had it all there. Nobody went to jail. Hillary Clinton never went to jail. But you know who did go to jail? A lot of people were working for the CIA in China. And it happened shortly after Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, and it ended right after she left. Do you think maybe they got that information from ClintonEmails.com? Oh, but don't lock up Hillary Clinton.